Hey Sean, so it's been just a few days after your 16 days fire casino retreat, and from what I understand, you did it by yourself while camping somewhere in nature.
Yeah,
So can you say
yeah,
a bit more about the setup and maybe the background before you
mm,
started the retreat and how it went?
yeah, sure. So for those of you that have seen our previous Fire Casino video, you'll know that I did another Fire Casino retreat back last, maybe June, and it was like 8.5 days, and I felt that it was like kind of just starting to get going with the imagery and the things that were happening, and I was like, I want to give a a more appropriate and necessary amount of time to doing the practice. And so I've been trying to set aside the time to do this retreat, which initially I wanted to be 3 weeks, but it worked out to be like 16 days. For yeah, a few months now. I've been trying to make it happen. So it finally happened. So that's great. Um, and let's see. I think one of the things that I really wanted to try and make sure I did differently this time is I wanted to um, have a higher dosage per day. So this retreat was for the first 14 days, except for the first one, it was all between 12 and 14 hours a day of practice each day. So the vast majority of my time when I was awake, I was doing Fire Casino. That's the only pretty much the only practice I did for all of those days. So, and then I did kind of some other insight practice for the last couple days at the end. So this retreat in a way was for me unique in that I didn't dabble with anything else. All I did every day for massive amounts of hours was Fire Casino. Um, and I think yeah, I was initially kind of not sure whether I wanted to do it kind of as I did the last one where I would just stay at home and I go to this local Buddhist center and I'd meditate there during the day. But then I started reading this. There's this biography on Tenzin Palmo, who's a um lama, a Tibetan lama, and I was reading this book about her spending 12 years meditating 12 hours a day in a cave in the Himalayas. And well, okay, I didn't spend 12 years meditating in a cave, but I
But
was
you
kind
made
of
your
like,
contribution.
yeah, I was sort of like, well, if she could do this, I could just camp and do it that way by myself. And basically I was camping on what in Australia is called Crown land, so government land, and it's just an area where it's kind of set aside. You're allowed to camp. It has no facilities at all, so there's not even any water sources. There, there's at least drinking water. So there's no drinking water. There's no toilets. It's just camping basically in um, something between wilderness and like a pasture of cows. So I meditated beside a lot of cows and birds. Um,
Nice.
and it has the advantage though of beside it's fairly close to a town, so I could actually go into the town if I needed more supplies, which of course because I had no water I did or I would have died. So um yeah, that was the sort of setup for the retreat. I was camping beside a river
Nice.
and yeah.
That sounds beautiful. And in terms of daily practice, how did you organize your day? So when did you get up? When
Hmm.
did you practice? When did you place your meals? So just say a bit about the
Yeah,
schedule.
yeah, some basic kind of retreat logistics. Um, so this stuff I'm quite happy about actually how I did it. I think it worked out quite well. I woke up a little bit before sunrise each day, so like 6:30ish in the morning. Um, and it's it's interesting because I trained normally when you set an alarm at the same time every day, you kind of find yourself waking up around that time. But that got like much kind of more accurate over the course of the retreat than it would in normal life. And I find that kind of interesting. It's like I had like far better precision tracking of when I was waking up. And it's not like I you did that. People always talk about setting intentions and then somehow the correct amount of time happens. I didn't set any intentions, but it does feel like it was really accurate when my body was waking me up in the morning. um
Awesome.
yeah, and so I'd have this thing where I decided I was going to do things in 4-hour blocks, which is initially I didn't actually know whether I could do this, so it sort of requires a bit of unpacking because 4 hours is obviously a fairly long time for a solid block, at least for me. I mean, some people are much better, like, I don't know, single sit, long stamina meditators. I'm not. I generally don't do that much more than an hour uninterrupted. So basically, what I would do is I would start in some position and then roughly, although this wasn't fixed, every hour I would just switch to a different body position. So I had kind of a setup where I had my meditation cushion with me on a couple camping pads and a sleeping bag, and then I also had this sort of portable camping chair, which was also set up in the tent. I did all of the meditating in the tent because I didn't want to have to deal with insects. So I spent like 22 hours a day or some ridiculous amount of hours a day in this tent, in this 5-person tent. Um, and so I would just rotate from sitting on the ground in kind of Burmese posture to sitting in the chair. And in the chair, I could either kind of put my meditation cushion behind me to be more upright, or I could be more inclined. By not doing that, I also had a pillow with me, so I could also put the pillow behind me for like a more comforted experience. I could also kind of double up the pillow and do something in between. Um, and then I could also meditate lying down. So and then I could also just do it kneeling with the cushion between kind of under my butt, um, with my legs on either side. So I would just sort of rotate between these positions for 4 hours, only allowing myself. I mean, if I had to go to the bathroom at some point or whatever during that time, that's fine. Uh, I would allow myself sometimes to make a mindful coffee halfway through. Um, and and then basically after those 4 hours were done, then I would eat breakfast, which was basically cereal with uh yeah, it was basically muesli or oats or something with powdered milk and nuts. Because of course I had to bring everything into this place, so everything was sort of like powders and like non-heavy food items. So that added this weird sort of backpacking element to everything. Um, I I loaded all of this gear actually that I took with me on my bike rather than carry it on my back, in part so that I could access the town to get more supplies, and also because my back isn't great, so I didn't want to carry tons of weight on my back. Um, and so yeah, that was my kind of setup, and then I do another 4 hours, and then I didn't really know what I was going to do for the other meal, but basically what it ended up being, and this is like the kind of like a bit nutritional sacrifices of the retreat. So I really wasn't getting like fresh fruit and veggies during this retreat. I kind of there was one day when I resupplied myself that I got some veggies, but of course they go bad quite quickly, particularly when it's hot in the sun. Um, so yeah, I basically what I would do is I would have a meal that was some combination of, let's see, I had onions. Onions were basically the only actual like sort of real food I had with me. So I'd have like onions with couscous and texturized soy and a soup mix of, and I had a variety of different soup mixes. And and then I also had some peanut butter, which I could also melt into it. Um, and
That's awesome.
yeah, that's pretty much how I did that. So the advantage of this is, okay, yeah, it's not great nutritionally, but it's very fast. It's an extremely, so I really didn't spend much time making meals, which was kind of my goal for the retreat. Um, because it's very easy to end up spending a lot of time cooking. Like it can be, especially when you're trying to maximize hours, it can be problematic. So I was like, well, okay, I'm not going to eat great, but I'll kind of eat okay. I'll at least hit some basis for stuff. It's only for 2 weeks, and try to make it as fast as possible, which it, yeah, I feel like it worked quite well, given that there's no obviously catering or people providing me of food. The amount of time I actually spent preparing food, I think, was quite low. So, and of course, I had nothing was exactly pre-prepared because I had no refrigeration. So yeah, I'm pretty happy with it, really.
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
I
yeah.
I, I also I think that on the first retreat that I did alone, I think that I overcooked for myself. So I
Mm,
spent too much, meaning that I spent too much time preparing
yeah.
food. And it took me quite some time because I was ordering groceries, so that was easy. But then I was always cooking elaborate meals. And in hindsight, also towards the end of the retreat, I was simplifying it. And in hindsight, I would have just done some simple meal prepping. I mean, it was nice to enjoy the flavor when your
Yeah.
perception is enhanced, but I don't think that that's the main aspect of any retreat. So yeah, I would have simplified on the food. And then it's really
Yeah.
hard to do 12, or it's hard to do more than 10 hours when you have to cook the food. I think that's something that I also underestimated.
Yeah. Yeah, I think until you try to spend that many hours of a day doing something, you don't realize how much time other things like basic necessities
Yeah,
like eating or going to the bathroom or like really anything you don't realize, or making a coffee, like you don't realize how much time those things actually add up to out of the day until you're trying to actually do that, 12, 13, 14 hours, and then suddenly it becomes, oh wow, I just lost half an hour but I didn't do anything. How did this
yeah,
happen?
yeah,
So it's a bit like, I always think like, oh yeah, of course you could do 14 hours. You still have 2 hours spare in a day, and it's like it doesn't feel like that.
yeah, yeah. And on the
Yeah.
second retreat, we had a person who was hired for cooking, and that made it so much easier. I mean, I even had like 1 or 2 hours of free time, to just
Oh
do nothing
wow.
and chill. So yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, that's definitely that's an aspect that's definitely appreciate more when when you've experienced that and then you don't have that. Um I think the one thing I generally tried to do, sometimes I needed a bit of an attentional break, but I generally did try to be quite mindful, and sometimes I'd say about half the time I was trying to note, not particularly strictly, what I was doing as I was getting food or coffee ready or whatever. So yeah, yeah, that's also something that I wanted to be more strict about, because it's easy to be like, "Oh, I'm not meditating right now. I'm just gonna turn off the meditation app in my brain." It's harder. it's
And
harder
it
to keep
comes at a
that going the
cost.
whole time. Sorry?
Yeah, yeah. And
Yeah.
it comes also at a cost. You do lose some
Yeah.
momentum.
Yeah. So I was also trying to do that, at least not all the time, because um it's, yeah, it's, I mean, I don't, maybe we'll get into this later, but it's quite it can be intentionally exhausting also to do what I did. So sometimes the mind just like it needs like a rest.
Yeah,
Um
yeah, yeah, yeah.
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 Yeah. Oh,
And so,
sorry, yeah.
mhm,
I was just gonna complete. So my day schedule then would be I'd eat the second meal after the second 4 hours, and then I do 4 hours more, um and then after that, depending on how I was doing, I would do like another, so half an hour, hour and a half, something like that more after that, and it kind of depended on the day. Um, but I
mhm,
was kind of like my floor was going to be 12 hours, so that's like the minimum target I wanted to hit. I realized that the simplest way of doing this is just to have actually a timer that counts up. So I would just count up until I hit that 12 or 13 hours or whatever. None of this like single session stuff. I would pause it if I needed to eat or do something else. And I don't know, because previously it's maybe like a minor point, but it's I'd be trying to set like individual timers, and I was like, that's not this retreat. I'm much happier with the way I did that. It was quite simple.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Because I do like 1 hour sits,
Yeah.
and then within that hour, I probably actually meditate 50 minutes, but I
Mm.
count it as an hour.
Hmm.
Yeah. So I see the
Yeah.
benefit of counting actual sitting time. And did you do any walking practice?
Yeah, it's a good question. I I generally didn't. No, it's in part because the yeah, it's interesting because you had talked about doing kind of walking practice and doing it with the nimitta outside, but I found that I was generally not getting a strong enough nimitta very often to do that um during the day, at least. During the day, it was not really working that well. I also though wasn't after your very clear warnings, I was definitely not doing it off the sun. So it also might be a question of the brightness of the light source, right? Maybe I needed just like a super powerful torch to like
Torch, yeah.
because I had a headlamp, but like even its brightest setting was not a particularly mind-blowing level of lumens.
Yeah.
So
Whenever I did it outside, not mentioning the sun,
yes,
I
don't
did it
do it
with
with the
a
sun.
phone, with a phone LED.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh,
So
that's another actual. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
those are usually pretty bright.
Yeah, see, I had to be very careful because I had any power I was going to use over that multiple weeks. I had 3 power bars, and those 3 power bars needed to provide for any time I was doing audio recordings or I wanted to take, a photo of something, or I needed to there are a couple times I needed to communicate with people for unresolved different things that popped up at the beginning of a retreat. So I couldn't, like, I did not having electricity also meant I needed to budget power in a way that was like very quite like strict overall. It was kind of okay, but I wouldn't have been able to use a phone for that because I would have lost phone battery basically.
Yeah. Yeah, that's absolutely impressive. Like it's really impressive listening to all the creativity and like all the little considerations that you needed to have to make the whole retreat possible.
Yeah, I'm quite happy. All that aspect of stuff, I'm quite happy. I feel like I've done a camping retreat with someone else before, but there was closer access to water. I've done something that was sort of like a half camping retreat, but we still had access to some facilities. Um, so this is sort of in some kind of way like I've been building up to, I guess, figuring out how to organize this in such a way that it actually works. And it worked pretty well. I think it's doable.
And from what I understand, you are an experienced camper
Yeah, yeah,
in
I
terms
grew
of
up.
casual camping. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I grew up camping. I'm Canadian, so it's well, which doesn't mean necessarily you grew up camping, but yeah, in my family I did.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so being like in a non-official campsite, just kind of being off grid, so to speak, is not something that was like unknown to me. Although I don't think I've ever done that for so long. That was still
Yeah.
like quite a long time to do that.
No, I think overall you get like an aesthetic badge or something like that.
Aesthetic.
You qualify.
Excellent, excellent. Yeah.
And another question about like the practical side is
Mhm.
about what, so you mentioned that you used a torch to get the limit.
Yeah.
You didn't have any candles, no actual candles.
No, I had no candles. I had a headlamp with three settings. So it had bright white light, not as bright white light, and red light.
Yeah,
So I would generally, because I'm still a little bit unsure even of the using the bright headlamp setting too much for eye strain, even when it's bright out, which maybe is overly cautious. I'm not sure because I know like the contrast I think matters a lot. Um, but generally I would be using the red light whenever that seemed bright enough for some kind of decent contrast. And when it was particularly bright during the day, I would switch to the dimmer of the two white lights. Um,
yeah.
and so it would just sort of work like turn it on, and then I'd close my eyes and turn it off, which usually involves like a couple presses. Um, and I'd, but before this is sort of like I guess a basic point, but you're looking at it and the light's on, and then you want to close your eyes and then you want to turn the light away from you as quickly as possible and then turn it off because otherwise you're going to cycle through the other light settings which are going to mess it up. So there's sort of like a specific way one can do that, at least with that particular headlamp, that yeah, that I think is works better that way.
And
Yeah,
so
it
your
didn't do it with
goal then
candles.
would be to have like a uniform black background and a clear dot when you close your eyes.
um yeah, although I mean the background in reality is rarely clearly black. And
Hmm.
in fact, during the day when contrast between the light and the background is not that much, you get a um of course that thing where you get kind of like the whole scene recorded. You get an after image of the entire scene, and sometimes it can be quite shocking. There's one time it's like, am I still looking at stuff as if my eyes were open? And I kind of had to do a double check and like, wait a minute, no, my eyes actually are closed. I'm not looking at the actual thing. I'm looking at the after image. So I'd say, yeah,
Yeah, from what
it,
I've heard, that's a common effect. So not only getting the after image, but getting a feeling that you can see with eyes closed.
yeah, yeah, it
So,
was so
all
complete.
right.
All right.
So there were days apart, like hours of it would happen always at a similar part of the cycle, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
But when I would see very clearly at the bottom periphery of my visual field. So I would have my
Mm,
eyes firmly closed and I would
yeah,
still see my feet and my legs and like everything that's around here
that's
as
super interesting.
clearly as if my eyes were open.
But with like the contrasts inverted?
No, I would see it in perfect in just perfect color. It would appear exactly the same as with my eyes open.
That's wild.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like I want to say the lights and darks were inverted when this happened to me, but then again, my brain was confused enough to think that I was possibly still looking at things with my eyes open, so I'm not like totally sure.
Yeah. Yeah,
Mm,
I can totally understand that.
yeah.
So then let's talk about when now that we started talking about the visuals, let's talk about how you develop more
Mm,
more complex visuals. So what was your
yeah.
strategy? Session after
Yeah.
or refresh after refresh, session after session, day after day.
Yeah, so I think at least in my case and like the beginning part is somewhat, I guess, grindy, I guess, in kind of putting my brain into order to do that. And so it's just, yeah, a lot of refreshing. And things are, um, and yeah, because you're cycling at the same time, but you're also not really able to go very far. And with Fire Casina, it's sort of like sometimes you get the Nimitta and it just stays like nice and red and whatever for a while, and you just kind of sit with that and it lasts for quite a while, and then eventually you lose it, or you realize you become distracted and have already lost it or whatever. Or it evolves to the black dot and you kind of sit with the black dot for a long time. But sometimes it progresses so immediately quickly to the murk that it's just like you get the nimitta and it's like and it's gone. It's like, and so those times at the beginning when you can't get through the murk yet involve just like a ridiculous amount of refreshes, because it's like you reload and then it's gone. You load, it's gone. It's it's kind of interesting because on an experiential level it's quite dissatisfying because it's like you're constantly having to work. You don't get to just kind of rest with any version of the nimitta, and the merc is not organized, at least in my case, is not organized enough you can actually concentrate on it. So your brain will, if you try to just focus on what at that point is perceived as noise, your brain will just tune out and you'll end up somewhere else, like in thought or whatever. So it's not, you can't really do that yet either. And this is something that perhaps this is where different maybe kind of natural visual aptitudes or stuff like this maybe make a difference, because I can see, I don't know if like for some people they're able to get some organization there happening earlier, but definitely in my case that's not the case. I have to work to
Yeah, I
get
think
that
that's everybody's case, and I
okay,
think that that's the
okay, yeah,
mark.
yeah,
Yeah,
um
yeah, it's incredibly unmotivating to practice because for me, I would have. I mean, the second time though was
yeah,
way easier because you have faith in what comes after, and you know
yeah,
that it's a phase, and in order to get through, you just need to sit and meditate. Even though
mhm,
nothing is happening, you just sit and meditate, and it goes away. So in that perspective, the second time when I had the Merc for a few days, it was
Yeah.
easier to practice. But yeah, it's just I remember there were days when I had a feeling that I'm sitting and meditating, but I'm not actually even meditating. Like, who am I kidding that what I'm doing is meditation? Because, like this feeling of mental presence with the phenomena, or like kind of being able to attach your attention
Yeah.
to the coarseness of phenomena
Yeah.
is gone. And then actually what so the advice that and there are days when you're just sleepy. Did you have that?
Oh yeah, like
Yeah.
the energy levels flux a lot, and it's constantly trying to perceive something and perceiving effectively nothing that can actually be locked onto is like it's just a whole ton of efforting. It's a ton of efforting, and as you say, it's like you don't feel like you've actually accomplished anything because you haven't actually been able to focus on anything. There's nothing there to focus on.
Yeah.
Um, and
Yeah,
so
so the
you,
advice that
yeah,
I received also for the Merc is that when if you get sleepy, it's better to sleep. Because and that's
mm,
actually partially true for me because I think that this sleepy state, probably also the cocktail of neurotransmitters that you get,
mm,
can get you through the Merc more quickly. So that isn't to say that you should
interesting.
try to sleep the whole day,
Yeah,
but if you nod into some napping or something like that,
uh-huh.
that's totally fine. And that's likely to shorten the frustrating part.
Yeah, that's a cool tip. I like that. That actually reminds me of another kind of, it's I guess a sort of related to the kind of logistical organization points of the retreat, but I normally I nap during the day. Now, what I would do is when I wouldn't nap, but I'd be lying down to meditate and I'd still be having my headlamp and um oh, I should add that I also had like a sleeping mask blindfold. So particularly when it was light out, I'd be like, yeah, so you end up with this complex series of movements because you're getting the light, you're closing your eyes, you're lowering the sleeping mask, you're turning off the light. Um, but when I was lying down, I I was just like, I'll keep doing this, and if at some point like I end up having fallen asleep, I'll just refresh the nimitta and go again, but also being completely fine and accepting of if at some point in this my body decides that it's falling asleep, then that's okay. And that was always okay. It was just like a part of the practice. Sometimes I'll fall asleep and I'll be like, I'll, you know, wake up and it's funny because sometimes I wake up and I can hear my snoring breathing. I don't really snore, so I still don't understand how this works, but like hear some like sort of breathing sound that to me is indicative of the fact that I had been sleeping just before then. Um, and so I'll know, okay, yeah, I lost awareness or whatever for a while. And then it's kind of be like, oh, okay, no problem. And then just keep going back to it. And I might go back to it and then I might lose it again. And
Yeah, yeah,
that was always fine. I just figured that I would stop doing that once my body was rested enough to not lose awareness between the refreshes.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Mm,
Or also what's quite typical for those stages are so I think at the entrance of the Merc, I would get a lot of the hypnagogic effects.
mm-hmm.
At
Mm,
almost every sit, I would just start to meditate, and very quickly I get into very vivid imagery. And as soon as I become aware of it, I just snap out of it.
yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. It's true that like I mean, I'm generally relatively aware of when I get hypnagogic imagery, but I feel like I want to say that didn't or barely happened on this retreat, which is a
Huh,
bit odd. Yeah, I don't know. Hmm,
interesting. Hmm.
yeah.
All right,
Yeah.
and so then what was your, so did you do any exercises like color control or shape control or anything like that to kind of stimulate the visual field, or what was your strategy?
Yeah, so this is the area where I yeah, we discuss a bit like before this video, but I have like an a bit of a weird relationship with Fire Casino because I'm not obviously it's like considered a magical with a K practice and whatnot, and that with intentions you can kind of shape your experience in different ways. And the thing is, on some sort of like internal motivation level, I don't actually have the much interest in actually doing things like making the nimitta move or change colors. I'm just like now, which isn't to say that I didn't try to change the color at all. I did a little bit and a little bit of success, but mostly like what has always I found fascinating about Fire Casino is just it takes you into these immersive experiences that are entirely fabricated by the mind. And like I've never felt like a strong calling to try and specifically cultivate particular experiences there. I just want to go on the adventure and the exploration. Um,
All right, so then say a bit more about the immersive generated experiences.
uh, yeah, so I guess I mean first I want to maybe I'll just go like once I actually started getting stuff in the Merc doing stuff. So you start getting like I get a lot of I guess what are called flows. I'm now trying to use the Fire Casino glossary terminology, but you get like sort of like particle flows across your visual field, and they're also kind of echoed with your somatic field. Feels like it's doing the same thing. Um, and you can kind of and those it's true that I can kind of control them. I can make that kind of move up or sideways or I think even diagonal, though it's not as easy. Um, and so you start getting those and kind of different at least like some kind of contrast that was a little bit happening but kind of noisy. Eventually I think the first kind of properly organized thing I got were like I don't know what to call it, but like some sort of like crystal field, I guess you could say. I started getting these like sort of like patterns of like just crystals across my visual field and sort of like this dim reddish color that at least for me is associated with the murk. Um and and then kind of everything yeah beyond that is where things I think get more interesting and where you start getting more immersive stuff. And it's yeah, I mean, I guess the one of the first things I got quite clearly is this kind of feeling of just opening up to like a field of stars. Um, which is interesting because the a field of stars in some level visually is not really that different than kind of a lot of the noise that's happening in the murk on a visual level, but because it was accompanied by a type of like panoramic shift in attention
And the
um
depth, probably.
and the depth exactly it has a different feel. It has a slightly like embodied you're there feel that that the kind of whatever noise slash dots particles whatever beforehand didn't have. And so it's experientially rather different, even though visually, in some sense, not really that impressive, I think. Um,
Yeah. Yeah, I
yeah,
think like getting effects like this is also a sign of kind of the complex increased complexity of the visual field. So when you start getting depth, or when you start getting this panoramic impression, and especially when you can kind of rotate and then the your surroundings kind of stay fixed. So you
yeah,
can reveal, there is a term for that, but you can
yeah,
kind of reveal more of it when you turn your head. So it starts to mimic reality more and more. And it becomes more 3D, and it can also start to move independently, so it's not static anymore.
yeah, yeah. And I think it's quite interesting how that happens because it's like the it's like the visual signal starts becoming important enough that the other aspects of our awareness, like proprioception and things like this, eventually start to like seed and follow suit with what the visual experience is. So sort of like, okay, this is convincing enough that now I'm going to start feeling like, oh, I'm moving backwards in space. Or, oh my goodness, this is so big and I feel like I'm moving back. And it's not, I think, that your actual body is moving back, but you have the feeling as if it were, because it's like your visual experience is so influencing you that you believe it on some level. And because you believe it on some level, then you get these kind of, it's kind of like immersive embodied effects
I mean, I
without
think it's kind
anything
of
happening to
also,
your body.
yeah, sorry. I think it also kind of interconnects also on a physiological level with your, is it vestibular system?
Totally. Yep.
Yeah, so it actually gives you a realistic embodied experience of moving, falling, shifting, whatever. So it's not just that you are in one of these like 3D simulators or something like that where they put a screen in front of you and that the screen is moving. So
Yep.
it gives you a slight impression of your environment moving. Your body also mimics the whole experience fully, and I think that that's what's fascinating.
Yeah, no, that's exactly it. It's like if, let's say, you're experiencing something that's like the type of falling or the dipping movement that, say, happens on a roller coaster, then
Yeah,
because I think
yeah.
that's one of those extreme kind of examples where we all know that that feels like something. To have your body moving at these crazy different angles we're not used to, it really feels like something. And the in Fire Casina, you also get those feelings. Um, so yeah, how your body feels, let's say, if you were spinning backwards in space or diving forward, or some even like there's some relation with objects here in other ways too, because if some like massive object comes at you from one side, there's a sense of like moving kind of away and back in relation to it, and you get like that kind of a thing too. It's like there's a sense of whoa, and it's actually a it, that's not just a visual or a movement thing. There's an embodied thing there that happens in real life. It's just we don't have these kind of dramatic examples that
Yeah, yeah.
you get in Fire Casino, which is super cool because it makes it starts to feel much more believable on some level, even when the visuals aren't necessarily that realistic. You start feeling a lot more like you're there because of these kinds of effects.
Or for instance, if I would see a glowing orb, sometimes I could feel the heat, or like I could feel
Oh wow.
like it
Yeah.
interrelates with all my habituated interactions with the environment, and it just replicates all of it. So if I see a glowing sun or something, then I would also kind of have a feeling on my skin, or also the feeling of warmth in my body.
See, this is the stuff that's super cool, because this is where, I mean, we're not going to go into a major discussion on predictive processing in this video. There's another meditative.dev video where Roger and I talk about that some time ago now. But this kind of like is a thing where people assume, oh, if you talk about an embodied experience or this kind of thing, it's like, yeah, you're getting that from your body, but really it's more like your mind has a hypothesis on what's going on, and then it um normally it your experience is actually your kind of best guess of what's going on, but normally that's constrained by actual reality and the senses and whatever. And the thing is, with Fire Casino, it stops being constrained by that stuff. So if your mind like becomes convinced that you're, I don't know, tumbling backwards or something, because that's what your visual experience is being at that moment, then it's like, well, if this is happening, then the most probable thing is that my body also feels like this. So simulate those kind of vestibular proprioceptive feelings also, because that's obviously the best explanation that goes with this visual stimuli that's happening, which is super cool. And I feel like people, I don't know, there's something scientifically really interesting there.
Yeah, yeah, definitely.
It makes that particular kind of predictive theory of mind, it makes the case for that quite strongly when you're experiencing this kind of stuff.
Yeah, but I'm also grateful for it, because if it wasn't for that, because on the one hand, it seems a bit defeating as this intellectual, developed being that we are as humans, to actually have all your behavior explained through this predictive model.
Yeah.
Like I remember when I heard it for the first time, it was both fascinating and a bit disappointing, because I thought that I was more original than that. But on the other hand, I mean, we also did this in, I mean, there are countless experiments in linguistics as well.
Cool.
But then on the other hand, I'm really grateful for it, because if it wasn't for that, then practices like fire casino would not work as well.
No. No, if you really needed things to be there in order to experience them, if you needed the
Yeah,
physical world to be in that particular like particular configurations, then suddenly a lot of things are not potentially accessible without actually the world being in that way. But if the world actually doesn't necessarily matter in
neat.
all cases, and that really opens things up
I love
in
it.
ways that yeah, it makes it a pretty
Uh,
fascinating thing.
and you
Mm.
mentioned in a previous conversation that you also had more of like some energy type of experiences. So talking about the visual field and the somatic experiences.
Yeah, yeah. So um I mean, early on, it'd been fire casino practice, particularly on retreat, you definitely start noticing there's this like this kind of correlation between some sort of staticky movement and like the speed of it and everything else in the visual field, and something happening that seems to kind of be the exact same thing happening in like a somatic um field. So there's this sort of like somatic, pixelized, noisy thing that kind of is happening in a particular pattern. And then the visual field also has that same kind of thing happening. And I think in some sense, that's kind of, at least for me, that's kind of that's the start of what can become these kind of extreme energetic phenomena. Um, because that starts off as not a particularly strong thing. It's like subtle, but it's there. And as I say, like you can get it in these like flows of movement kind of across your visual field, but you also feel it moving across your field somatically. So it's sort of like moving across your face. You feel like it's almost like a particle wind blowing across your face. And it has a little bit of like the quality of, I don't know, like being in like having Saturn's rings move through you or something, in a sense of like there's a bunch of particles that are all kind of moving together in the same direction, basically. And so uh, yeah, one night, and we can go back into the kind of the other immersive experiences I got, but one night I fell into something where I was getting um increasingly kind of realistic 3D kind of scene visuals. But the problem is, at the same time, it's not necessarily a problem, it depends on how you take it, but I was becoming kind of more and more what you might describe as spacey, but you could also kind of say in this sort of like high equanimity, kind of getting into really strong fading of perception. So kind of perceiving things, but they're kind of not really there, and you're not really sure. They're almost like have like a kind of dreamlike quality of a dream. You can't really remember what you were just dreaming about, but you kind of know that something significant was happening. Um, kind of like that quality. And I started getting really strongly into this state, and then my body started kind of a lot of the body sensations and stuff just stopped. So you'd say like this is also kind of getting into increasingly formless experience. So I'd have my body sensations cutting in and out. Suddenly, like I would be more aware of some aspect of my body, but then it would basically just be gone, and I'd be sort of almost some sort of like, I don't know how to describe it, like some sort of energetic phenomena in some sort of space, but without any um yeah, sense of my body. And I would also get, and the interesting thing, and I was mentioning it yeah, when we talked previously, is like I get I'd have thoughts, and I'd have them completely chopped off in the middle of the thought. So like an internal kind of voice dialogue in my mind, it would be happening and I would perceive it clearly, and then there'd just be nothing. It would be like obliterated into void. Um, and is a and while I've had experience with cessations and whatnot before, or fruitions, the the type of clarity and the sharpness of how this kind of cutting off was happening was quite shocking. It's weird to have one's internal monologue just like instantaneously evaporated in the middle of it. It's like, I think on some sort of basic internal level, we're used to our thoughts kind of, they might kind of arise, and it's this kind of subtle murmur in the background of experience, and then it um kind of fades out or stops, but there's some sort of natural way in which it ends. And this feels like, yeah, it was vaporized. It didn't get to do what it's normally, and almost like what it's supposed to do. It got incinerated at some instantaneous point in the process. um, yeah, and so I was having that experience, but I was also having at the same time the sense of like uh, almost being like frozen in this like kind of electrical field of energy, and where almost it feels like your being is completely held in position, and it's almost like in a kind of so but it's weird because you're in like almost like a sedated state where you can't really feel your body. um your Yeah, it's interesting to try and actually capture how it is. It's like extremely relaxed, extremely calm in certain ways. You're basically shut off from the external sense doors and obviously thought as well. But at the same time, you have this super intense like happening somatically all over your body. And it feels like mm, it's potentially not easy to leave that state. It's not like something where you notice and then like as soon as you've left it, it's like you're in it and you know it's happening, and you're also like stopping it would actually be quite difficult.
It's a
And
bit
I
like
think
you're
yeah,
hypnotized somehow, right?
kind of, or yeah, you're like hypnotized and kind of frozen in place, and you're sort of in like some sort of trance, but you're also kind of aware that it's happening at the same time. Um, yeah, and I would have this, or I had this, and it would just be like the intensity and kind of it starts to feel when this kind of energy phenomena gets really happening, it starts as it gets more intense, it kind of starts to feel more like solid also. It's like you're almost like fusing in some sort of fusion reaction into like this um thick, dense, energetic mass or something is and so this would just build and build and build and get like thicker and more dense and more dense and more dense, and then it's like this entire accumulated energy at some point this is a point I think before this happens it can actually if this kind of thing has happened to me before, but if it hasn't happened to you before, I think it's actually quite, and the first time it was for me, it can be quite scary, like because you feel like, oh my god, what's gonna happen? Like it feels like something is spiraling out of control into the unknown.
A bit like as if what I think I understand is that as if something is taking over your nervous system or something like that.
Yeah, yeah, it's like you've been sort of hijacked or become just a vessel or a place for this crazy energetic movement that seems to kind of have a life of its own. Um and but this time I did hold on to that, and eventually it just like this entire thick almost fused mass of super fast rapid like energized particles just exploded. It shattered into pieces everywhere, with no sense of yeah dual anything in any sense of the word. and and yeah, it was wild. It's sort of like it's weird because on one hand it's like there isn't some at least notable sense of self when that happens, but at the same time it's as if you are almost like an iceberg that had just been exploded um into pieces from the most but yeah, I don't even know how to describe it 'cause I'm like reaching for ways of hitting on it, but it's quite hard. But it's interesting because after I came out of that state, it's definitely you notice that the sense of there's a number of processes of sense of self that are normally kind of operating, they get suppressed after that happened. So even the sense of let's say, I don't know, grabbing my hand to look at something, um there's definitely a much more a sense of, oh, this is just happening with no sense of me or agent in it, but not even a sense of me or agent that's recognized as such that actually I'm disidentified with, but more like that's just not happening at all. Um, so yeah, that was a pretty wild, a wild type thing. Hmm.
Mm, what you were saying about the lack of agency that you experienced, it
Yeah.
leads me to another question that I wanted to ask you. So, about the agency that you experienced within yourself, well, or the lack of it, and also the agency in the visuals. So
Hmm.
whether you had a sense of producing them, or whether they were producing themselves, or whether there was some sort of sense of agency in some elements of the visuals.
Yeah, that's a good question. So yeah, I had a lot of scenes, and a lot of them were three-dimensional to varying degrees. Um, let's say I might have one of like a canyon with boulders falling down it, or something, while with some sort of camera tilt happening at the same time. Um, I I mean, there's a sense of what I paid attention to was impacting what I was seeing to some degree. So there's a sense of, at least some of the time, there was a sense of kind of influencing in that way. Um, I didn't, and this goes into generally my experience comparing it with past retreats. The first Fire Casino retreat I did, I had much more a sense of I was effectively operating as some sort of independent agentic agent in some sort of constructed virtual space. Um, whereas I would see some point in the scene, and then I would sort of fly to that point in the scene with all of the associated kind of stuff around, or the visuals along the way changing as I did that. Um, and this one, I only had that kind of feeling a few times, but it wasn't nearly as dominant as I had the first time. Um, I would sort of sometimes try, I'd be like, yeah, I'd like to go down there to that, I don't know, particular canyon or cavern or whatever I was visualizing at a particular moment. And most of the time, I wouldn't actually go anywhere. Just despite despite intending that. Which I mean, and this goes into kind of my general sense of the retreat is I had the first time I did Fire Casino, which is about 3 years ago, with far less dosage per day. Um, like I actually had more kind of immersive experiences than I did this time, doing a far higher dose and being, I think, a much more advanced meditator than I was back then. And I find this at the time it was somewhat frustrating because I had all these hopes of like, oh, I want to get to fully realistic, lifelike, immersive experience in Fire Casino. Um, and then it's like, because I'd had brief moments on the last two retreats, even the 8-day retreat, where I had like brief moments of like fully realistic um, visuals happening. And I thought, well, this time I'll just do way more fire Kasina and I'll do it for longer. And of course, if I do both of these things, when I've already gotten to the door of that multiple times, I'll definitely get a bunch of that happening, which is what I want. And that didn't happen. I meditated my ass off, and that didn't happen. I always stayed with these sort of kind of red hued kind of 3D-ish images, but that also often had like undefined sections to them where I would intuit what I was looking at, but like part of it wouldn't be clear. Um, and yeah, it's a mystery as to why that happened. To be honest, I mean, it is a bit disappointing. There's obviously lots of other interesting stuff that happened, like that energy thing is just one example. But yeah,
Did you
not
have
sure.
any faces or eyes or anything like that showing up?
Uh, yeah, I had a bunch of like faces. I had a bunch of faces forming and stuff like that. It's I had very weird motifs and very like specific repeating visuals of certain kinds. Like, let's see. My mind absolutely loves like a slow motion like wing flapping and also a slow motion like horse leg style galloping. It kept repeatedly putting both of these visuals with varying degrees of clarity actually like the actual visuals of the, let's say, the bird or the dragon or the horse or whatever other animal, it varied from being fairly well defined to being almost just like very just pixels and noisy and undefined in many places, but the movement was always perfect. It's like even if the rest of it wasn't there, the movement was always there, which is quite interesting. So it's almost like if you have a bunch of pixels and you make or particles and you make them move in the way that a human moves, even if they're just particles, you still get the sense of, oh, that's a human moving. And it was sort of like that. Um, so I had that. I feel like I'm in a mentally healthier place because last time I did this kind of thing, I had a lot of images of demons and like kind of slightly evil creatures, even like kind of like laughing at me and stuff like this. And this time I had like a lot of like cute kind of cartoonish three-dimensional rodents. I don't know.
Cute.
It was like a lot of like kind of like I don't know gerbils and hamster like creatures with like big eyes and very like sort of friendly looking. And I mean sometimes you get a sense of kind of intelligence from them and stuff, but it yeah, I don't I don't know why that's what's happening, but I guess like if we want to take a capture of my psyche, um probably better to have like friendly cartoonish rodent family than it is to have yeah, a bunch of demons.
Maybe something about your environment that you were in. I'm like trying to find associations.
I don't know. I was getting them. I mean, eventually I did have a mouse that ate through a bag I had outside and then ate through a box and ate some of my couscous. But um that this was this was happening before that mouse showed up. I I don't know. It was really strange, but in general, a lot of the images and sort of the entities and stuff that showed up were like there were a couple demonish things, a couple like maybe this is the influence of being in Bali, but a couple of like kind of Balinese like demon creatures sort of, but mostly it was all just like very friendly stuff and it was like I had like images of just like people hugging each other and stuff. Like it was, it was all like very. like, or like putting
That's
one's arm
beautiful.
around like someone else. It was all very like, um, I guess wholesome. You could
Yeah,
say it was like the most like G-rated fire experience in certain senses.
amazing. I love it.
Yeah.
And so to go back to the question, in terms of the agency that you felt within yourself, how did that play out during the retreat?
Um,
So you mentioned that after this very intense energetic experience, for some
mhm.
time you had no sense of the doer.
Yeah. Yeah, even that, like the sensations that manifest as that, clearly perceived or not, were not happening. Um, now the yeah, I guess I don't know. Can you make your question a bit more specific? Maybe I'm not quite sure
So did you do
where to
any
go with it.
practices and did you monitor that aspect of your experience? So the sense of self, the sense of duality in relation to the self, the
Mm,
sense of agency, the sense of thinker, the sense of
yeah. Okay.
perceiver.
Yeah. I mean, there was a lot of time where it was sort of like there was a okay. There's a perception of the Fire Casino screen or visuals that are happening, and then there's a bunch of sensations that are kind of roughly analogous to me that are happening somatically in a place that's, like there's sensations of me that are happening here, and those are clearly like the me kind of um the Shawn sensations, and then there's the sensations that are the actual Fire Casino object that are somewhat further ahead. Um and I I kind of wanted to do more kind of vipassana on that relationship between perceiver and perceived, but at the same time that's not really what I was trying to do Fire Casino for this retreat. So I mostly did um more of that type of investigation at the end on the last couple days when I was no longer doing Fire Casino. Um but yeah, it was definitely like there are these sensations over here that are the observer observing, and then there are these sensations over there that are the phenomena that's happening. Um,
Do you feel that having done Fire Casino supported the sensory clarity that you needed to do Vipassana type practices?
I think so. I think let's see what I can say. I feel like my perception's still actually quite sharp. I feel like I'm able to perceive different aspects of um let's say Shawnness with a high degree of clarity. Um can and I feel like some aspects of uh some kind of hidden, like completely not perceivable aspects of self that were very subtle, um now have somehow been like brought more into light where I can actually work on them. Because there was a long time where anything that I could perceive was just happening on its own. Um, and but at the same time, I kind of knew that the kind of the job, if you will, is not done. Um, so it was sort of a point where like, okay, I don't clearly perceive where I should be working. And now it's like I have clear perception of where to be working again. It's sort of fixed my practice conundrum actually.
Hmm.
So in that way, it's actually, yeah, it's quite motivating. Hmm.
And so another thing I was curious about is whether you did some jhana practices or whether you perceived any
Hmm.
jhanic factors or characteristics while you were doing Fire Casino.
Yeah. Um, I mean, I generally didn't do jhana stuff. Um, I and even with Fire Casina, I kept it. Maybe this is part of the problem, but it's also just sort of my natural tendencies. I kept it very like impermanent, very fluxy. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I was very, yeah, tuned into like moment by moment kind of changes. Um, and yeah, I felt like jhana practice was potentially it wasn't clear to me how much jhana practice actually supports doing Fire Casino. I still don't like. I don't actually have a sense of how that is, but my sense was that it supports Fire Casino not as well as Fire Casino itself. Um, and so I was sort of tempted. I was tempted to go and okay, I'm gonna like try, you know, going through the jhanas, and I kind of entered first jhana once slightly because I was like, yeah, maybe I'll try this a little bit, but I didn't really actually seriously try to do any jhana work. I basically like restrained myself. I'm like, no, 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 you don't 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 do that now. Save that for another retreat. You can work the jhanas then. Which isn't to say that I wouldn't use Fire Casina initially and then work on the jhanas. Like I'm not opposed to that, but I, the I think my natural tendency is not to focus on the visual field. And if I do just kind of letting go stuff or jhana stuff or something like that, I will not like my body will go into somatic sensations. That's always sort of where my dominant experience seems to drift in meditation. Um, and even on this retreat, like there were times when like that energy thing where my experience did drift from visuals and it just drifted sort of like internally much more into the somatics and or into formless experience where there is no visuals. Um, so yeah, I kind of wanted to. Hmm, yeah, I wanted to keep this the 2 weeks at least the 14 days. I wanted to keep them pure Fire Casino, which maybe I don't know in hindsight maybe wasn't the best idea, even though that's what the advice I've read has suggested. The results that I got maybe I don't know. Maybe I should have done less dose, or maybe I should have been mixing in other stuff, and that would have moved something forward. But I feel like if I had done something else and then it hadn't worked out because I'd done something else, then that would have been much more harder to live with kind of
Yeah.
how I'd gone about things and the way I did it. So I'm still kind of yeah. It felt like the right move, and I stand by it as having been the right move from where I was.
Yeah, I think that Fire Casino, since it's generally unexplored, at least in the West, so we don't have a very
Yeah,
strong tradition and knowledge about it, I think it's still an experimental domain.
yeah,
So
yeah,
yeah, in that sense, we don't actually have information about what happens when you do pure Fire Casino or when you mix it up, or whether any of it supports the other and in what way.
yeah. Yeah, I think that makes sense, and that's my sense also. It's like there's just not that much information there. Still, obviously, there's now a lot more than there was. Yeah, there was this one retreat I did where I was doing letting go practice the whole time, like quite intensely, and then And I think I was mostly trying to meditate on formations actually that retreat. But um then I just tried doing Fire Casina a few times, and the few times I tried doing Fire Casina, I got within like 3 hours past the Merc. Um and so and that yeah, it sort of calls into question how much doing Fire Casino the whole time actually is the move. But and this is actually a question um, that actually would be good to ask Daniel Ingram perhaps, because I think you mentioned the first time he did Fire Casino, he was on some sort of retreat where he hadn't been doing Fire Casino for the first bunch of the retreat, and then some of his like strongest visuals from Fire Casino were apparently on that retreat after he started doing Fire Casino midway through. So like to me, it's not clear that doing exclusively Fire Casino is the best move, but you're right. I don't think we know. I don't think we know yet what the best move actually is. Um,
Yeah, because what I experienced in terms of combining practices is that Fire Casina supports or intensifies other practices. So
yeah,
for me, the clarity for inside practices is increased if I do Fire Casina, or if I do it during a Fire Casina
yep,
retreat, or anything that has to do with the body, so any kind of energy practices or that sort of stuff also has more malleability and more clarity.
mm,
And jhanas become more accessible after some Fire Casino practice. But I would also be really curious if some other practices can be a good precursor to Fire Casino.
yeah, yeah. That's. I mean, my sense also is I think Fire Casino as a support practice is actually quite great. Um, I think that it can sharpen things up quite quickly. It respects. It's like a kind of a concentration practice. It respects um depending on how you do it, but it can quite like respect the impermanence kind of side of things too. Um, and so it's at least my experience is it's easier for jhanas to fall into a kind of like a fuzzier, less sensory clarity type of state. Whereas with Fire Casino, that doesn't really happen in the same way. It I mean, within of course all of the modulation because of cycling, but um, it tends to keep things sharp, at least in my experience, and get things sharper. Um, yeah, yeah, but like what supports Fire Casino? I don't know. I mean, it definitely. We talked about it in the last video, and when doing Fire Casino without being good at sort of like letting go, um, can be less than ideal. I think some ability to kind of like let go or defabricate is to like soften things up is important because Fire Casino I think can get aspects particularly kind of for people that are earlier on kind of in their meditation practice. It can I think stuff can get quite like tight and kind of yeah edgy um earlier. So having some like softening skills and knowing okay just kind of like let this happen is is important. Um,
It's been in that sense a bit of the Mahasi style noting practice, noting retreats, because that practice can also lead to similarly edgy states. Maybe with a bit of
yeah,
a more of an emotional and mental tension. But yeah, that also requires some skill of flowing with it, or yeah, knowing that it will be over, or just like relaxing into the sensation. So kind of letting go of some of yeah attempts to control stuff, or yeah.
yeah, yeah, no, definitely. Um,
Is there anything else that you would like to share about the retreat? Because there is probably something that I'm not asking that would be worth mentioning.
Good question. Um, so let's see. There's maybe a couple extra kind of weird effects that I noticed that happened like visually that I I don't know, I hadn't noticed them previously. So one is like almost something like, you know, when you're watching like a film that's actually on analog tape and you get like these like splotches that are like on top of what's actually the film or whatever you're watching. Well, I would routinely get those while doing this. So there'd be the screen, but then there'd be like these random blips and blops and stuff that would be like thrown on top. Um, uh, and I don't know whether that had happened before and I just hadn't noticed it, but I thought that that was kind of a curious effect that was happening. It was like some random like extra artifacts and interference were kind of happening on top in this random way. Um, so that's one thing. Let's see what else. I think that I was much more aware of like the weird visual kind of field ripples this time than I was on previous retreats. Also, like you really do see like the kind of visual field or like the screen or whatever like warps and twists in these different ways. And I mean, of course, you can also notice this kind of thing outside just looking around if you kind of tune into it. But yeah, that stuff was interesting to notice the extent to which it was happening. And I'd get some other effects where like I'd be looking at something like the nimitta with like the black ring around it and then the red slowly diffusing out. And then I get like effect that almost felt like someone dug their fingers into the corner of this nimitta ring combination and then like pulled from different points. So I don't quite know how to describe it, but it's like if you take, let's say there's some sort of image here and I pull here and it moves kind of in a triangular fashion, like up a bunch of the stuff kind of distorts it that way and you pull here and it distorts another bunch of stuff in sort of a triangular way that way and you do this again and again and again, you get this like crazy kind of like accordion warping distortion thing happening. And I thought that was like a quite weird, interesting extra effect that was happening. Because it seemed to come out of nowhere and be quite inconsistent with everything else that was going on at that moment. It's almost like, yeah, some sort of weird digital manipulation thrown into this otherwise like naturally unfolding, relatively consistent, if slightly ephemeral screen or scene, I
Yeah.
guess. Yeah. Um, yeah, and I guess yeah, I had some great insight practice the last couple days. Re so yeah, the I think I'd really recommend it if you do a bunch of fire casino and you want to leave a couple days at the end where you just really kind of dive into investigating um kind of the relationship between subject and object and anything that feels like a knower and you really just want to zone in on that and go for that um and just try and perceive everything as it's happening as it arises everywhere. I think Fire Casina is a really good setup to doing that. I think my like insight practice those last 2 days was extremely fruitful, even though it was only 2 days because the concert the concentration, despite like the visuals that I got not being particularly impressive, the concentration I came out of the retreat with is quite ridiculous. So yeah.
Cool.
in that sense, definitely works as a concentration practice. Extremely strong. I'm still slightly like altered by the degree of concentration I have. Although it's kind of
Yeah.
funny because I'm slightly dysfunctional at the moment from the amount of concentration. It's like in this is running joke with my partner that basically highly concentrated means dysfunctional. It's just pretty funny.
Yeah.
It's, yeah.
Yeah, I think you mentioned also that you are lacking some organizational skills or kind of
Yeah.
overseeing the content of your environment or
Yeah, it's like whatever I'm focusing on, I'm so locked into that I'm missing this important like peripheral information that normally just naturally kind of penetrates your awareness. Well, it doesn't. So, like, yeah, like I was saying, I might be having someone might be speaking, and this might give rise to a thought, and then I'm not meditating, so I'm just like really focusing on this thought, and then I'll go from this thought to starting to speak about this thought, but I won't have any of the contextual information of what's actually been happening in the conversation. Like I won't check back in, and then suddenly I'm like, I'm interrupting people that I would never normally interrupt, and it's like, what, what's going on? So it's a bit clumsy, but I, my experience with previous retreats is this doesn't last too long. Now this was more intense, so who knows? Maybe I'll be like this for a while. We'll
yeah,
see.
that's why I like to leave a few days, maybe 2 or 3 days between the end of the retreat or end the retreat earlier so that
Mm,
I could get back to my normal functioning without the risks of spoiling stuff or
yeah, yeah. I mean, I that would have been it would have been nice. I feel like everything still feels a bit too intense with interaction and stuff. It's like I'm a little bit too sensitive to stimuli still. And but the I mean, it's hard to do retreats. I got to do a long retreat. It's hard to find time and stuff in this modern kind of structured world to do that kind of thing. So I'm still extremely thankful I got to do it.
yeah,
So
yeah, I totally understand.
yeah.
Hey, thanks. This was a beautiful interview. I really enjoyed talking about your retreat.
Thanks. Yeah, I enjoyed this a lot too. It was nice to kind of have like drawn out of me a number of the things that happened there. Um yeah.
Yeah,
Um who knows? Maybe we do an addendum. I have a bunch of kind of recorded spontaneous phenomenology recordings that I did while experiencing different things. So I don't know if there's actually something I've missed in there that's worth bringing up again, but if there is, who knows? We might do a brief
yeah,
little encore blip to this.
yeah, that'd be cool. And
Yeah.
yeah, I guess we'll continue making these as we are doing our retreats.
I like this. It's not necessarily even just a fire casino thing. It's like this is like a type of retreat report interview series. So,
Yeah.
yeah, we could yeah. I like this. All right, cool. Okay,
All
Taylor,
right.
it's been
Thanks a lot.
lovely. Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you.
Bye.
Bye.